I was grabbing coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor at the lake house. "Congratulations on the sale. Sorry to see you go, but the new family seems lovely." My hand froze around the mug. Sale. What sale? I called her immediately. "What do you mean, sale?" "Your lake house, dear. The moving truck just left. Your parents were there helping with the transition." My blood turned to ice. I inherited that house from my grandmother last year. I never put it on the market. Racing to my car, I drove the 40-minute route with trembling hands, praying this was some terrible mistake. But when I pulled into the gravel driveway, there it was a bright red "Sold" sign stabbed into the front yard like a knife through my heart. My parents' silver Buick sat in the driveway next to a moving truck. Through the kitchen window, I could see strangers boxing up my grandmother's china collection. The same china we used for every holiday dinner, the same plates where Grandma taught me to make her famous apple pie. I burst through the front door to find my mother Linda directing two burly movers as they carried out Grandma's antique rocking chair, the chair where I'd spent countless summer evenings listening to her stories about growing up during the Great Depression. "Mom, what is going on?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She turned around with the most casual expression, as if I'd just asked about the weather. "Oh, Gail, perfect timing. We sold the house. The paperwork went through this morning." "You what?" The room started spinning. "This is my house. Grandma left it to me." My father, Robert, emerged from the hallway carrying a box of my grandmother's photograph albums. His weathered face showed no remorse, just mild irritation at my presence. "We needed the money for Madison's wedding. You understand?" Before I could respond, my sister Madison bounced through the door wearing a designer sundress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, and she was practically glowing with excitement. "Gail, you're here." She clapped her manicured hands together. "Thanks for the wedding present." I stared at her in disbelief. Wedding present? "The house sale, Daddy explained everything. We got $350,000. Can you believe it? That's enough for the venue, the flowers, the catering, and even the honeymoon in Tuscany." My legs gave out and I sank onto the couch where I used to read Nancy Drew mysteries with Grandma on rainy afternoons. "You sold my inheritance without telling me." Dad set down the box and pulled out a folder of documents. "Technically, we had power of attorney. We handled all of Grandma's affairs in her final months. Remember, the paperwork was already in place." "Power of attorney for medical decisions," I shouted, "not to steal my inheritance." Mom waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic, honey. Madison deserves a beautiful wedding. She's marrying Dr. Jonathan Pierce from the cardiac surgery department. Do you know what kind of family they are? This wedding needs to be perfect." A young couple appeared in the doorway with 3 small children clinging to their legs. The woman, probably in her early 30s with kind eyes and tired smile lines, looked embarrassed by the family drama unfolding in what was now her living room. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We're the Thompsons. We bought the house. Maybe we should come back later." No, Dad said quickly. "This is just a small family misunderstanding. Gail was just leaving." Mr. Thompson handed me a manila envelope. "These are all the legal documents. Everything was properly notarized and filed with the county. The sale is completely legitimate." My hands shook as I opened the envelope and saw my own signature on the deed transfer. Except it wasn't my signature. It was close enough to fool a casual observer, but I knew my own handwriting. They had forged it. The Thompson children. 2 boys and a girl wandered past me into what used to be my grandmother's sewing room. The little girl, maybe 5 years old, was carrying a worn teddy bear and looking around with wide, curious eyes. "This house feels happy," she announced to no one in particular. Tears burned my eyes. This house had been happy. It was where I learned to bake bread on snowy mornings, where Grandma taught me to identify birds by their songs, where I brought my college textbooks every summer to study in the peaceful silence by the water. Madison was showing Mrs. Thompson her engagement ring, a massive diamond that caught the light like a disco ball. "Jonathan proposed on a yacht in Miami. Isn't it gorgeous? The wedding is in 2 weeks at the Denver Botanic Gardens. It's going to be absolutely magical. Mrs. Thompson smiled politely, but I could see the discomfort in her expression as she realized she was standing in the middle of a family betrayal. I stood up on shaky legs and walked to the kitchen window that overlooked the lake. This view had been my sanctuary during my parents' divorce when I was 12, during my breakup with my college boyfriend, during the long nights when I sat with Grandma during her chemotherapy treatments. Now strangers would wake up to this view every morning. "We should go," Mom said briskly. "Madison has a dress fitting this afternoon, and we need to confirm the flower arrangements." As my family filed out of the house like nothing monumental had just happened, I remained frozen by the window. Mrs. Thompson approached me carefully. "Are you okay, dear?" I turned to face her, seeing genuine concern in her expression. This was my grandmother's house. She raised me here every summer. I had no idea it was being sold. Her face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We had no idea there was any family dispute. The real estate agent, Patricia Wells, assured us everything was handled properly." "It's not your fault," I managed to say. "You bought the house in good faith." But as I walked to my car and saw the sold sign swaying in the breeze, I knew this was far from over. My parents had committed fraud, and I was going to prove it. 3 days later, I drove to my parents' suburban Denver home, armed with printouts from the county clerk's office, showing the suspicious timing of the power of attorney documents. Their house, a modest ranch style in a middle-class neighborhood, felt like enemy territory now. Mom answered the door wearing a floral apron and holding a stack of wedding invitations. "Gail, perfect timing. We're addressing the final invitations for Madison's wedding. Your cousins from Seattle are flying in, and Aunt Carol is bringing her famous chocolate cake." I pushed past her into the living room where Madison was sprawled on the carpet, surrounded by wedding magazines, fabric samples, and what looked like enough tulle to outfit a small ballet company. "We need to talk," I announced. Madison looked up from a magazine featuring dream wedding destinations and sighed dramatically. "If this is about the house again, I really don't want to hear it. I'm stressed enough about the seating arrangements." Dad emerged from the kitchen carrying a cup of coffee and wearing his favorite fishing t-shirt. For a man who had just committed fraud, he seemed remarkably relaxed. "Sit down, Gail," he said in the same tone he used when I was 10 and in trouble for breaking a window. "Let's discuss this rationally." Rationally? I pulled out the documents I'd printed. "You forged my signature to steal my inheritance. There's nothing rational about grand theft." "Don't be so dramatic," Mom said, settling into her recliner next to a stack of bridal magazines. "Madison deserves a beautiful wedding. Look at this venue." She thrust a glossy brochure at me showing the Denver Botanic Gardens decorated with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers. The price list on the back page made my stomach lurch. The venue rental alone was $40,000 for one evening. "Madison," I said, trying to appeal to whatever sisterly bond we might have left. "Grandma specifically left me that house. You know how close we were. She wanted me to have a place to remember her." Madison finally looked up from her magazine, but instead of sympathy, her expression held pure annoyance. "Gail, you're being completely selfish. This is my wedding, the most important day of my life. Do you want me to get married in some cheap community center because you're being stubborn about an old house? That old house was worth $350,000. Exactly." She jumped up, scattering magazines across the carpet. "Which is exactly what we need for a proper wedding. Jonathan's family is very prominent in Denver society. His father is a judge. His mother chairs 3 different charity boards. They expect elegance." Dad handed me a thick folder filled with receipts and contracts. "Look at these expenses, Gail. We've already committed to everything. The catering is $15,000 for 200 guests. The flowers are $12,000. Madison's dress was $8,000, but it's a designer original from New York." I flipped through the receipts in horror. A $20,000 band, $5,000 for wedding favors, $3,000 for chair covers, $800 for napkin rings. Napkin rings that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. "This is insane," I whispered. "No wedding needs to cost this much money." "My wedding does," Madison snapped. "Jonathan's sister had her reception at the Four Seasons with ice sculptures and a champagne fountain. I'm not going to be embarrassed by having something less elegant." Mom pulled out her phone and started showing me pictures from other society weddings. "Look at the Pierce family's social media. This is the standard we're dealing with. Madison needs to fit in with this crowd." The photos showed elaborate celebrations that looked more like movie sets than family gatherings. Massive floral arrangements taller than most people tables, set with gold-rimmed china and crystal stemware dance floors surrounded by towering candelabras. "What about my feelings?" I asked, sinking onto the couch next to a pile of silk fabric samples. "What about honoring Grandma's wishes?" "Grandma would want Madison to be happy," Dad said firmly. "She always said family comes first." "I am family." "Of course you are," Mom said in a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "And you're going to be the maid of honor. I picked out a beautiful lavender dress for you. It's hanging in Madison's closet." Madison clapped her hands together like a delighted child. "Oh yes, you'll look gorgeous in lavender. It matches the bridesmaid dresses perfectly. And wait until you see the bouquets, white peonies and baby's breath with silver ribbon." She grabbed my hand and started dragging me toward the hallway. "Come see everything." The shoes arrived yesterday and the jewelry is absolutely stunning. I found myself pulled into Madison's childhood bedroom, which had been transformed into a bridal command center. Her bed was covered with wedding magazines, fabric swatches, and enough jewelry boxes to stock a small store. A massive wedding dress hung from the closet door covered in intricate beadwork that probably took months to complete by hand. "Isn't it perfect?" Madison spun around the room like she was already dancing at her reception. "The seamstress in New York worked on it for 6 months. Every bead is hand-sewn." On the dresser sat wedding shoes that looked like they belonged in a museum covered in crystals and pearls. Next to them, a jewelry set that included a necklace, earrings, and bracelet that sparkled like miniature fireworks. "Madison," I said carefully, "do you understand that this money came from selling the house where Grandma died? The house where you used to play dress-up in her attic?" For just a moment, her expression flickered with something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly, replaced by defensive anger. "Grandma is gone, Gail. She doesn't need the house anymore. But I need this wedding. I need to start my marriage properly with dignity and respect from Jonathan's family. What if they don't accept you anyway? What if all this money is wasted?" Her face flushed red. "They will accept me. They already love me. Jonathan's mother said I'm exactly the kind of woman she hoped he'd marry." Mom appeared in the doorway holding the lavender bridesmaid dress. "Try this on Gail. The wedding is only 2 weeks away and we need to make sure it fits properly." I stared at the dress, a confection of silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. I'm not wearing that dress. I'm not participating in a wedding funded by stolen money. The room went silent. Madison's face crumpled and she sat down heavily on her bed among the wedding magazines. "You're going to ruin my wedding," she whispered, tears starting to flow. "You're going to destroy the most important day of my life because you're jealous." Jealous? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Of what? Of my happiness, of my perfect life. "You've always been jealous that I'm prettier and more successful, and now I'm marrying someone amazing while you're still alone." Her words hit like physical blows, but they also revealed something important. Madison genuinely believed she deserved all this luxury, regardless of how it was obtained. Dad appeared in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Gail, you have a choice to make. You can be part of this family and celebrate your sister's happiness, or you can be stubborn and selfish. But understand this, if you try to interfere with Madison's wedding, you're no longer welcome in this house." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. My parents were willing to disown me to protect their theft. "Fine," I said quietly. "I'll wear the dress. I'll be in the wedding." Madison's face brightened immediately and she wiped away her tears with a silk handkerchief. Really, you'll be my maid of honor." "I'll be there," I promised. But as I left their house that afternoon, I wasn't thinking about lavender dresses or white peonies. I was thinking about justice, and I was planning something they would never see coming. The law office of Martinez and Associates occupied the third floor of a glass building downtown with a waiting room that smelled like leather and determination. Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s with graying hair and an impressive wall of legal degrees, reviewed my documents with growing concern. "This is definitely fraud," she said, setting down the forged deed transfer. "The signature analysis alone would be enough to prove it in court, but there are complications." "What kind of complications?" She leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. "Your parents had legitimate power of attorney for your grandmother's medical affairs. They're claiming they genuinely believed it extended to financial matters after her death. It's a gray area that could take years to resolve, and legal fees would likely exceed $50,000. My heart sank. "So they're going to get away with it?" "Not necessarily, but we need to approach this strategically. Criminal fraud charges would be more effective than civil litigation, but that requires convincing the district attorney to prosecute." I left her office feeling deflated but not defeated. If the legal system moved too slowly, I would have to find another way. That evening, my phone rang. Aunt Carol's familiar voice, warm and cheerful, filled my car as I drove home from work. "Gail, honey, I just got Madison's wedding invitation. How exciting. I haven't been to such a fancy wedding since your cousin Jennifer married that lawyer in Chicago." "It's going to be quite an event," I said carefully. "Your mother told me about the venue, the Denver Botanic Gardens, and a live orchestra. Madison must be over the moon. I'm bringing my famous chocolate cake for the dessert table." There was a pause, and then Aunt Carol's tone shifted slightly. "You know your mother mentioned you were having some concerns about the funding. I hope you're not letting that overshadow Madison's special day." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What exactly did Mom tell you?" "Well, that you were upset about selling your grandmother's lake house to pay for the wedding. But honestly, dear, what else was that house going to be used for? It's not like you were living there full time." "Did she mention that they sold it without telling me that they forged my signature?" Another pause, longer this time. "Oh, Gail, I'm sure there was just some miscommunication. Your parents would never do anything dishonest. They're just trying to give Madison the wedding of her dreams." Over the next week, I received similar calls from Uncle Dave, my cousins in Seattle, and even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them had received wedding invitations, and all of them had been told some version of the story that painted me as an unreasonable sister trying to spoil Madison's happiness. The most painful call came from my cousin Jennifer, who I'd always considered a close friend. "Gail, I'm really disappointed in you," she said without preamble. "Madison called me crying yesterday. She said you're threatening to boycott her wedding over some property dispute." "It's not a property dispute, it's theft. Come on, your parents raised both of you. They sacrificed for years to give you good lives. If they needed to sell an inherited property to help with Madison's wedding, I think that's actually really sweet." "Jennifer, they forged my signature. They committed fraud." "You're being dramatic. Parents help their children all the time. Maybe the paperwork wasn't perfect, but the intention was good." I ended the call feeling more isolated than ever. My entire extended family had been turned against me, convinced that I was the villain in this story. The breaking point came at what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at my parents' house. I arrived to find the living room filled with relatives, Aunt Carol and Uncle Dave, my cousins from Seattle, and even my grandmother's elderly sister, Aunt Ruth, who rarely left her assisted living facility. Mom had prepared a feast that filled the dining room table, roast beef with all the trimmings, homemade rolls, 3 different kinds of vegetables, and 2 desserts. It looked like a holiday gathering, except the only thing we were celebrating was my family's betrayal of me. Madison arrived fashionably late with her fiancé, Dr. Jonathan Pierce. I'd only met him once before at last Christmas, but I remembered him as polite and well-educated, with the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of privilege. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished, and he wore a tailored suit even for casual family dinner. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm, and his smile seemed genuine. "Gail, good to see you again. Madison tells me you're going to be her maid of honor. That means a lot to her." Before I could respond, Dad called everyone to the dinner table. As we passed around serving dishes and filled our plates, the conversation naturally turned to wedding plans. The florist confirmed that all the peonies will be fresh from Holland. Madison announced cutting her roast beef into tiny, precise pieces. And the string quartet has performed at 3 weddings for families in Jonathan's social circle. Aunt Carol clapped her hands together. "It sounds absolutely magical. You're so lucky to have parents who can make your dreams come true." Uncle Dave nodded approvingly. "Robert and Linda have really gone above and beyond. Not every family would make such a sacrifice for a daughter's wedding." I set down my fork, unable to take another bite. "Sacrifice, is that what we're calling fraud now?" The table went silent. Aunt Ruth, who was 91 years old and sharp as a tack, looked up from her mashed potatoes with interested eyes. "Fraud," she repeated. "That's a serious accusation, dear." "Yes, it is," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My parents sold my inherited property without my knowledge or consent. They forged my signature on legal documents. In any other context, that would be called theft and fraud." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sorry, I think I'm missing some context here." Madison grabbed his hand protectively. "My sister is upset because my parents sold our grandmother's old lake house to help pay for our wedding. She thinks she should have been consulted, but honestly, the house was just sitting empty." "It was my house," I said firmly. "Grandma left it to me specifically in her will. But surely family property should benefit the whole family," Cousin Jennifer said diplomatically, "and a wedding is such a special occasion." Aunt Ruth set down her water glass with a sharp clink. "Agnes left that house to Gail specifically. I was there when she made the will. She said Gail was the only grandchild who visited her regularly during the cancer treatments." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Mom quickly stood up and started clearing plates, even though most people weren't finished eating. "Let's not dwell on unpleasant topics," she said brightly. "Who wants dessert? I made apple pie and chocolate cake." But I wasn't finished. What about the $80,000 that disappeared from Grandma's savings account in her final months, or Uncle William's coin collection that went missing from his assisted living facility? The silence was deafening now. Jonathan looked between Madison and me with growing confusion. "What $80,000? Aunt Ruth asked sharply. Dad's face had gone pale. "Gail, I think you should leave." "I think I should call the police," I replied. "You will not ruin Madison's wedding," Mom shouted, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "We have worked too hard and spent too much money for you to destroy everything now." Jonathan stood up slowly. "Perhaps I should go. This seems like a family matter that needs to be resolved privately." "No." Madison jumped up and grabbed his arm. "Don't go. Gail is just being dramatic. She's always been jealous of me, and now she can't stand that I'm getting married first." But Jonathan was already reaching for his jacket. "Madison, I think we should postpone dinner until your family works through these issues." "There are no issues." Madison's voice was rising to a near shriek. "The only issue is my sister trying to ruin my wedding because she's bitter and alone." Jonathan paused in the doorway and looked directly at me. "Gail, are you saying that Madison's parents committed actual fraud to pay for our wedding?" The entire room held its breath, waiting for my answer. "Yes," I said quietly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." He nodded, once his expression thoughtful and troubled. "I see. Madison, we'll talk later." After he left, the family dinner exploded into accusations and arguments. My cousins defended my parents, saying I was being vindictive. Aunt Ruth demanded to know more about Uncle William's missing belongings. Madison locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out. When I finally left that house, I knew there was no going back. My family had chosen sides, and I was completely alone. But sometimes being alone is exactly what you need to see the situation clearly. And I was beginning to see something my family hadn't considered. Dr. Jonathan Pierce came from a prominent family with significant legal and social connections. If he started asking questions about fraud and theft, my parents might find themselves in much deeper trouble than they ever imagined. Private investigator Jake Morrison operated out of a cramped office above a coffee shop surrounded by filing cabinets and computer equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. He was a former police detective in his 50s, with tired eyes and a mustache that had seen better days, but Sarah Martinez had recommended him as the best at uncovering financial fraud. "Your parents have been busy," he said, spreading bank statements and property records across his desk. "This pattern goes back 5 years." I leaned forward to study the documents. "What kind of pattern?" "Elder financial abuse. They've been systematically taking advantage of elderly family members who trusted them to handle financial matters." He pointed to a highlighted bank statement. "Your great-uncle William signed power of attorney documents 6 months before he died, supposedly for medical decisions. But look at these withdrawals from his savings account." The numbers made my stomach lurch. $15,000 in cash withdrawals over 3 months, all signed by my father. Uncle William's family said his coin collection went missing from his room at the assisted living center. I said, "I contacted the facility. Your parents were his only regular visitors in the final months. They had keys to his room and access to his personal belongings." Jake pulled out another set of documents. "Here's your grandmother's bank records. In the 6 months before her death, $68,000 was transferred from her savings to an account controlled by your parents." I thought they said 80,000. That was a conservative estimate. The actual amount was closer to 90,000 when you include the jewelry and antiques they removed from her house before the estate was settled. I felt sick. How many other relatives did they steal from? "I'm still investigating, but there's evidence of suspicious financial activity involving your grandfather's brother Harold, your grandmother's sister Edith, and possibly 2 other elderly relatives who died in the past 3 years. Jake pulled out a timeline he'd created, mapping out the deaths and financial irregularities. The pattern is always the same. They volunteer to help with medical decisions, get power of attorney, then drain bank accounts and sell valuable possessions before anyone notices. And the lake house was their biggest score yet. Exactly. $350,000 from the house sale plus whatever they took from your grandmother's accounts. That's close to $500,000 stolen from elderly family members. I stared at the documents, trying to process the enormity of my parents' crimes. What about the wedding? Is all this money really going to Madison's wedding? Jake pulled out credit card statements and receipts. Some of it. But look at these expenses over the past 2 years. He showed me charges for luxury vacations, expensive restaurants, designer clothing, and home renovations. My parents had been living well beyond their modest retirement income, funded by stolen money from dead relatives. "The wedding is just their most brazen expense yet," Jake explained. "They probably figured it would be harder to question wedding expenses than personal luxuries." My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Final dress fitting tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please be there. I need my maid of honor." I showed the message to Jake. "The wedding is in 5 days. What do I do?" "That depends on what kind of justice you want. We have enough evidence for criminal charges, but that process could take months. If you want immediate impact, you need to expose them publicly. At the wedding, it's risky. You could be charged with disrupting a lawful assembly, but it would certainly get everyone's attention." I thought about Madison blissfully planning her dream wedding with stolen money. I thought about Dr. Pierce and his prominent family unknowingly becoming accessories to fraud. I thought about my grandmother who trusted her son to take care of her financial affairs and got robbed instead. "There's something else," Jake said, pulling out a manila folder. "I found evidence that your parents have been planning this for longer than you think." He showed me a series of emails between my parents and a financial planner dating back 18 months before my grandmother's death. They were calculating the value of her assets while she was still undergoing chemotherapy, Jake explained. They knew exactly how much money they'd have access to, and they were planning how to spend it. The emails were cold and calculating, discussing my grandmother's real estate value and investment accounts like she was already dead. In one exchange, my mother wrote, "Madison will need at least $200,000 for a proper wedding. The lake house should cover that easily." "They planned to steal my inheritance before Grandma even died," I whispered. "And they've been stealing from other relatives to maintain their lifestyle until they could cash in on the big prize." I left Jake's office with a USB drive full of evidence and a terrible understanding of who my parents really were. They weren't just thieves. They were predators who targeted the most vulnerable members of our own family. That evening, I drove to Madison's apartment to attend her final dress fitting. She lived in a trendy downtown loft that she could barely afford on her nurse's salary, but the view of the city skyline was impressive. The apartment was filled with wedding gifts, crystal vases, silver candlesticks, fine china, and kitchen appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant. Cards and thank you notes covered every surface. "Can you believe all this?" Madison gestured around the room with pure joy. "Jonathan's family has been so generous. His mother gave us a complete set of Italian silverware, and his sister bought us that gorgeous crystal chandelier for the dining room." The seamstress, elderly woman named Elena, who spoke with a thick Eastern European accent, was making final adjustments to Madison's wedding dress. She worked with the precision of a surgeon, pinning and tucking until every seam was perfect. "You look beautiful," I said, and it was true. Madison glowed with happiness, and the dress transformed her into something ethereal and elegant. "I can't believe it's finally happening," she said, admiring herself in the full-length mirror. "Jonathan and I have planned every detail. The honeymoon in Tuscany, the house we're going to buy in Cherry Hills, the children we want to have." "Madison," I said carefully, "do you ever wonder about the money? Whether it's right to spend so much on one day?" Her expression hardened. "Don't start, Gail. We've been through this. The money came from family assets, and I'm family. I deserve to have a beautiful wedding." "What if the money was stolen?" "From who? Grandma's dead. She doesn't need it anymore." "What about Uncle William's coin collection? What about the money that disappeared from Grandma's accounts while she was dying?" Madison turned away from the mirror to face me directly. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to know. My wedding is in 5 days, and nothing is going to ruin it." Elena finished her adjustments and began packing up her sewing supplies. "Dress is perfect now," she said in broken English. "You will be most beautiful bride." After Elena left Madison and I sat in her living room surrounded by wedding gifts and thank you cards, the silence stretched between us until she finally spoke. "Gail, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Okay." "Are you planning to do something to ruin my wedding?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her. She was 26 years old, beautiful, educated, and about to marry a successful doctor. She had everything most people could want, but it still wasn't enough. She needed the most expensive wedding money could buy, regardless of where that money came from. "I'm planning to be your maid of honor," I said. She smiled with relief and hugged me tightly. "Thank you. I love you, Gail. I know this has been difficult, but after the wedding, everything will go back to normal." But as I drove home that night, I knew nothing would ever be normal again. In 5 days, I was going to stand up at Madison's wedding and tell 200 guests exactly how their beautiful celebration was funded. Because sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to expose them in front of everyone they're trying to impress. The Denver Botanic Gardens had been transformed into a fairy tale setting that would have made Disney jealous. 20-foot floral arrangements flanked the ceremony space with white roses, peonies, and baby's breath creating towers of perfection that must have cost more than most people's cars. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, catching the afternoon sunlight and casting rainbows across the manicured lawns. I stood in the bridal suite, a converted greenhouse that had been decorated with silk draping and more flowers than a funeral home, watching Madison float around in her wedding dress like a princess from a storybook. The dress, with its hand-sewn beadwork and cathedral train, probably weighed 30 pounds and sparkled with every movement. Can you believe this day is finally here? Madison spun around, carefully mindful of her elaborate hairstyle that had taken 3 hours to complete. Look at those flowers, look at this venue. Everything is absolutely perfect. Through the windows, I could see guests arriving in luxury cars and designer outfits. Dr. Pierce's family had clearly brought their A-game with women in couture dresses and men in tailored suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary. My own family looked slightly overwhelmed but proud, dressed in their finest clothes and trying to fit in with Denver society. Mom bustled into the bridal suite carrying Madison's jewelry in a velvet box. "The photographer wants to get pictures of you putting on your grandmother's pearls," she announced. I watched Madison fasten the pearl necklace that Grandma had worn at her own wedding 70 years ago. The pearls looked beautiful against Madison's skin, but all I could think about was how Grandma would feel knowing her jewelry was being worn at a celebration funded by theft. 5 minutes until the wedding coordinator announced through the doorway. My heart started pounding as I picked up my bouquet of white peonies and baby's breath. The flowers were beautiful, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them steady. The ceremony itself was breathtaking. Madison walked down the aisle on Dad's arm to the sound of a live string quartet, her dress trailing behind her like something from a royal wedding. 200 guests rose to their feet as she passed, and I could hear actual gasps of admiration at her beauty. Dr. Pierce stood at the altar looking handsome and proud, flanked by his groomsmen in matching gray suits. When he saw Madison approaching, his face lit up with genuine love and happiness. For a moment, I almost felt guilty about what I was planning to do. The ceremony was traditional and elegant, with readings from Shakespeare and personal vows that brought tears to many eyes. Madison's voice trembled with emotion as she promised to love Jonathan through all of life's adventures, and his deep voice was steady and confident as he pledged his devotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the gardens erupted in applause, and the string quartet launched into a triumphant recessional. Madison and Jonathan practically floated back down the aisle, radiating pure joy and looking like they belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. The cocktail hour took place on the conservatory terrace, where ice sculptures and champagne fountains created an atmosphere of luxury that would have impressed European royalty. Guests mingled among topiary gardens, while servers in white gloves offered appetizers that looked like tiny works of art. I mingled with the crowd, listening to conversations about the stunning venue, the beautiful flowers, and the obviously expensive details that made this wedding extraordinary. Jonathan's family members discussed their recent trips to Europe, their children's private schools, and their charitable work with various Denver organizations. "This is absolutely magnificent," I heard Jonathan's mother tell my Aunt Carol. "You must be so proud of what your family has accomplished here." Aunt Carol beamed with pride. "Linda and Robert have worked so hard to give Madison the perfect day. They're wonderful parents." Dinner was served in the main conservatory, where round tables covered in fine linens were set with gold-rimmed china crystal stemware, and more flowers than seemed physically possible. The menu featured Colorado lamb Atlantic salmon and a vegetarian option that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant. The live band, a 12-piece orchestra that had performed at governors' mansions and embassy parties, provided background music that was elegant without being intrusive. When they announced the first dance, Madison and Jonathan took the floor to "At Last" by Etta James, and they looked like they were floating on air. I sat at the head table between the best man and another bridesmaid, trying to eat while my stomach churned with nervousness. In my purse, I carried printed copies of bank statements, emails, and property records that would destroy my family's reputation and probably end Madison's marriage before it really began. During the salad course, Jonathan's father, Judge Pierce, approached the microphone to give the first toast. He spoke eloquently about love, commitment, and the importance of family, thanking my parents for raising such a wonderful daughter and welcoming Madison into the Pierce family with genuine warmth. Then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like water, and walked to the microphone. 200 faces turned toward me expectantly, wine glasses raised and ready for a traditional maid of honor speech about childhood memories and sisterly love. Thank you all for being here to celebrate Madison and Jonathan. I began my voice surprisingly steady. This is certainly a beautiful wedding. The flowers are gorgeous, the venue is spectacular, and every detail has been executed flawlessly. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Madison beamed at me from the head table, probably thinking I was about to deliver a touching tribute to our sisterly bond. I'm sure many of you are wondering how a middle-class family from suburban Denver was able to afford such an elaborate celebration. I continued. The murmurs stopped. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but most were still smiling politely, waiting for the heartwarming explanation. The truth is, this wedding was funded by stealing from elderly relatives who trusted my parents to handle their financial affairs. The silence was deafening. You could have heard a champagne flute drop from across the room. I reached into my purse and pulled out the printed documents. My parents obtained power of attorney from my grandmother while she was dying of cancer, then used it to drain her bank accounts and sell her property without the knowledge or consent of her beneficiaries. Madison's face had gone white as her wedding dress. Jonathan was staring at me with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. They also stole from my great-uncle William, taking his coin collection and $15,000 from his savings while he was in assisted living, and from my great-aunt Edith and possibly other elderly relatives who trusted them to act in their best interests. Judge Pierce was no longer smiling. His expression had shifted to the cold, analytical look he probably wore when presiding over criminal cases. The lake house that was sold to pay for tonight's celebration was stolen from me through forged signatures and fraudulent documents. I continued. The total amount of money stolen from deceased relatives exceeds $400,000. Some guests were standing up now, clearly uncomfortable and looking for the exits. Others were pulling out their phones, probably to research whether what I was saying could possibly be true. Madison finally found her voice. Gail, stop your lying. You're ruining my wedding. I'm telling the truth, I said calmly, and I have documentation to prove every word. I held up the bank statements and property records. These documents show the pattern of theft going back 5 years. My parents have been systematically robbing elderly family members, and this wedding is their most brazen expense yet. Jonathan stood up slowly, his face pale but his voice controlled. Are you saying this entire celebration was funded by criminal activity? Yes, I said simply. The conservatory erupted in chaos. Madison was sobbing hysterically, my parents were shouting denials, and Jonathan's family was gathering in a tight circle that looked like a defensive formation. Guests were streaming toward the exits, abandoning their expensive dinners and whispering furiously among themselves. Judge Pierce approached the microphone and spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. This celebration is over. Everyone please leave immediately. The Pierce family will be conducting a full investigation into these allegations. As 200 guests fled the scene like escaping criminals, Madison collapsed into her chair with her beautiful dress pooling around her like a deflated balloon. The ice sculptures were melting, the champagne fountains had stopped flowing, and the perfect wedding had become a crime scene. Jonathan knelt beside Madison's chair and spoke quietly in her ear. I couldn't hear what he said, but her sobs grew louder and more desperate. My parents approached me with expressions of pure hatred. You've destroyed everything, Mom hissed. Your sister will never forgive you. Good, I replied. She shouldn't forgive theft and fraud either. As I walked out of the conservatory past the abandoned wedding cake and the wilting flowers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, peace. Justice was finally being served, even if it came at the cost of everything I'd once considered family. Within 24 hours of the wedding disaster, my phone started ringing. The first call came from Judge Pierce himself, his voice crisp and businesslike. "Miss Chen, this is Judge Pierce. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you and your attorney to review the evidence you mentioned last night." "Of course, Your Honor." "Please understand that my family takes allegations of criminal fraud very seriously. If what you said is true, we want to ensure that justice is pursued to the fullest extent of the law. Sarah Martinez and I met with the Pierce family attorney David Walsh in his downtown office that occupied an entire floor of one of Denver's most prestigious buildings. Walsh was a silver-haired man in his 60s who specialized in white-collar criminal defense and had connections throughout the Colorado legal system. Judge Pierce has asked me to review your evidence and coordinate with the district attorney's office if criminal charges are warranted. Walsh explained studying Jake Morrison's investigation files. These financial records paint a clear picture of systematic elder abuse. "What happens now?" I asked. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the DA today. Given the Pierce family's standing in the community and the obvious pattern of criminal behavior, I expect charges to be filed within the week." Meanwhile, Madison's honeymoon had been canceled before it began. Jonathan had moved out of their shared hotel suite and back to his parents' house, leaving Madison alone at the Four Seasons with a stack of wedding gifts and no husband. She called me 3 days after the wedding, her voice hoarse from crying. "Gail, you have to fix this. Jonathan won't talk to me. His family won't return my calls. You have to tell them you made it all up." "I'm not going to lie to protect criminals. They're our parents. How can you destroy our family like this?" "Our family destroyed itself when they decided to become thieves." The next call came from Mom, her voice sharp with desperation. "Gail, the police were here. They seized our computer and all our financial records. They're talking about criminal charges. You have to stop this madness." "It's too late for that. We can pay the money back. We can sell the house, liquidate our retirement accounts. Please don't let us go to prison over a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud, theft, and elder abuse. Think about Madison. Her marriage is falling apart because of what you did. Her marriage is falling apart because it was built on stolen money." The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, Dad was arrested at his morning coffee shop, handcuffed in front of his retired friends, who gathered there every day to discuss sports and politics. Mom was arrested at home while watering her flower garden, still wearing her gardening gloves, when the police led her away. The charges were extensive: elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, theft, and conspiracy. The district attorney held a press conference announcing the arrests, describing it as a shocking case of family members preying on vulnerable elderly relatives. Madison's world continued to crumble. Jonathan filed for annulment, claiming the marriage was based on fraud and misrepresentation. His family's social circle ostracized Madison, completely treating her like she was contaminated by association with criminals. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source, the Thompson family, who had purchased my grandmother's lake house. Mrs. Thompson called me personally. "We've been following the news about your family's situation. We had no idea the house sale was fraudulent when we bought it." "You're not responsible for my parents' crimes," I assured her. "Actually, we'd like to make this right. My husband and I discussed it, and we want to sell the house back to you at the price we paid. It feels wrong to profit from stolen property." "That's very generous, but you don't have to do that." "Yes, we do. Our children have been having nightmares since we moved in. They say the house feels sad. Maybe it needs to go back to its rightful owner to be happy again." Within a month, the legal proceedings had transformed my entire family's situation. My parents were facing 3 to 5 years in prison unless they accepted a plea deal that required full restitution and 2 years of probation. They were forced to sell their house, liquidate their retirement accounts, and surrender every asset they'd acquired through theft. Madison moved back into my parents' house after they were arrested, sleeping in her childhood bedroom and trying to rebuild her life as a divorced woman. Her nursing job barely covered her expenses, and she could no longer afford her downtown apartment. But the most unexpected change was in Madison herself. Without the constant validation of luxury and social status, she seemed to be discovering who she actually was beneath the designer clothes and expensive makeup. She showed up at my apartment 6 weeks after the wedding, carrying a box of items from our grandmother's house that the police had recovered during their investigation. "I brought you some of Grandma's things," she said quietly. Photo albums, her recipe book, some jewelry that somehow didn't get sold. I invited her in and we sat in my living room looking through pictures of summers at the lake house. Photos of us as children building sandcastles and catching fireflies when our biggest worry was whether it would rain during our camping trips. "I'm sorry," Madison said finally. I knew something wasn't right about the money, but I didn't want to ask questions because I wanted the wedding so badly. "Why was it so important to you?" She was quiet for a long time, studying a photo of herself and Grandma baking cookies in the lake house kitchen. "I thought if the wedding was perfect enough, Jonathan's family would accept me completely. I thought if everything was expensive and elegant, no one would see me as just a middle-class nurse who wasn't good enough for their son." "You were good enough exactly as you were. Apparently not good enough to build a marriage on honesty," she said bitterly. "Jonathan said he could have forgiven a simple wedding, but he couldn't forgive the lies." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, really talked, probably for the first time since we were children. Madison told me about the pressure she'd felt to compete with Jonathan's sophisticated social circle, and I told her about the months of grief and betrayal I'd experienced watching our parents destroy Grandma's legacy. "What happens now?" she asked as she prepared to leave. "Now we figure out how to be a family again without Mom and Dad setting the rules." "Do you think that's possible?" "I think Grandma would want us to try." 3 months later, I moved back into the lake house. The Thompsons had kept it in perfect condition, and their children had left drawings and thank you notes for the nice lady who let us live in her special house. Madison visited on weekends, helping me sort through Grandma's belongings and restore the garden that had been her pride and joy. We found boxes of family photos, handwritten recipes, and letters that told the story of our grandmother's long and interesting life. But the real healing began when Madison suggested we turn the lake house into something that would honor Grandma's memory while helping other families. "What if we started a retreat program for families dealing with loss?" she suggested one afternoon as we sat on the dock where Grandma used to teach us to fish. Grief counseling, support groups, maybe workshops on dealing with difficult family situations. "That's actually a brilliant idea. Grandma always said this house had healing energy. Maybe we can share that with other people who need it." And that's exactly what we did. 6 months after the wedding that destroyed and rebuilt our family, I stood in the same conservatory where Madison's marriage had imploded, but this time I was surrounded by hope instead of betrayal. The Denver Botanic Gardens had agreed to host our first annual fundraiser for the Agnes Chen Memorial Fund for Elder Abuse Victims, named after our grandmother. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that we were using the same venue where our family's crimes had been exposed to launch our campaign for justice and healing. But sometimes, the best way to transform pain is to use the exact same space to create something beautiful. Madison stood beside me at the podium wearing a simple navy dress instead of a wedding gown, but she looked more beautiful than she had on her wedding day because she was finally being honest about who she was. 18 months ago, my family committed crimes against elderly relatives who trusted us. She told the audience of social workers, attorneys, and families affected by elder abuse. Today, we're here to make sure other families don't experience the betrayal and loss that we caused. The Memorial Fund had raised $50,000 in its first 6 months, providing legal assistance and counseling services for families dealing with financial elder abuse. Sarah Martinez served on our board of directors, and Judge Pierce had become one of our most vocal supporters. Our parents had served 8 months in county jail before being released on probation with strict restitution requirements. They were required to attend counseling sessions and perform community service at elder care facilities, learning firsthand about the damage their crimes had caused. Dad worked at a senior nutrition center preparing and serving meals to elderly residents who reminded him daily of the relatives he'd robbed. Mom volunteered at an assisted living facility, helping with activities and transportation for residents who had lost their independence. They weren't welcome at family gatherings yet, but they were slowly beginning the long process of making amends. Aunt Ruth, now 92 and living in the lake house guest room, had agreed to supervise visits where they could apologize in person for their betrayals. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Aunt Ruth explained to me one afternoon as we watched Madison teach a grief counseling session on the back lawn. But it does mean giving people a chance to prove they've changed. The lake house had been transformed into exactly what Madison and I had envisioned, a healing retreat for families dealing with loss, betrayal, and complicated grief. We hosted weekend workshops, support groups, and individual counseling sessions, all surrounded by the peaceful energy that Grandma had always said made this place special. Our first retreat participants included a woman whose adult children had stolen her life savings, a man whose brother had forged his mother's will, and a teenage girl whose grandparents had lost their home to a financial scam. Each story was different, but they all shared the particular pain of being betrayed by people they trusted. Madison had discovered she was gifted at leading support groups combining her nursing training with an intuitive understanding of family trauma. She'd enrolled in a graduate program to become a licensed counselor, planning to specialize in elder abuse recovery. "I understand what it's like to be complicit in something terrible," she told her groups, "and I understand what it takes to rebuild your life after everything falls apart." Dr. Jonathan Pierce had surprised everyone by reaching out 6 months after their annulment was finalized. He called to apologize for the way his family had handled the situation and to ask if there was anything he could do to support our memorial fund. "I was angry and embarrassed," he admitted when he visited the lake house to make a generous donation. "But I realize now that Madison was as much a victim as anyone else. She was manipulated by people she trusted." Madison and Jonathan had coffee together once a month now, not as romantic partners, but as people who had shared something traumatic and were trying to learn from it. He was dating someone else, a pediatric nurse, who understood his work schedule and shared his love of hiking. Madison was focusing on her education and her healing work, discovering that she didn't need a man to define her worth. The most meaningful moment came on the anniversary of Grandma's death, when our entire surviving family gathered at the lake house for the first time since the funeral. Madison and I had spent weeks preparing cooking Grandma's recipes and decorating the house with flowers from her restored garden. Aunt Ruth sat in Grandma's favorite chair by the window, directing our efforts with the authority of someone who remembered exactly how our grandmother had liked things arranged. Uncle Dave and Aunt Carol brought photo albums and stories we'd never heard before. My cousins from Seattle brought their children who ran around the property like Madison and I had as kids. Even our parents were allowed to attend under strict supervision and with the understanding that they were guests in a house they no longer had any claim to. They sat quietly during most of the celebration, but when it came time to share memories of Grandma, Dad spoke with genuine remorse. "Agnes was the kindest person I ever knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She deserved better from her family, especially from her son. I'm sorry I betrayed the trust she placed in me, and I'm sorry it took losing everything to understand the damage I was causing." Mom nodded silently, tears streaming down her face. The expensive clothes and jewelry were gone, replaced by simple outfits from discount stores, but she looked more genuine than she had in years. As the sun set over the lake, I found myself standing on the dock, where this whole story had begun in my childhood memories. Madison joined me, and we watched the water reflect the golden light, just as it had when we were children learning to fish with Grandma. "Do you think she would be proud of what we've done?" Madison asked. "I think she's been proud of us all along," I replied. "Even when we made terrible mistakes, she never stopped loving us." "I miss her so much." "Me too. But I think she's still here in some way. Every time we help a family heal from betrayal, every time we stand up for someone who can't protect themselves, we're carrying on her legacy of caring for others. The lake house was full of laughter and conversation as our extended family shared dinner together for the first time in over a year. Children played in the yard where we'd once chased fireflies, and adults told stories about the woman who had brought us all together. That night, as I prepared for bed in the room where I'd spent so many childhood summers, I found a letter that Grandma had left for me in her desk drawer. Madison and I had missed it during our initial cleaning because it was tucked inside an old cookbook. "Oh, my dearest Gail." It read in her familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, then you've probably discovered that people aren't always who they seem to be, even people in our own family. I hope you'll remember that standing up for what's right is more important than keeping peace at any price. This house has seen generations of joy and sorrow, celebration and conflict, but it has also been a place where people learn to forgive themselves and each other. Use it well, and remember that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it's painful. Love always, Grandma. I sat by the window reading her words by moonlight, understanding finally that everything we'd been through had led us to this moment of genuine healing. The pain had been necessary to burn away the lies and reveal what was worth preserving. Now, as I close this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were not who they seemed to be? How did you find the courage to stand up for justice even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or helped you think about your own family relationships, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding the strength to rebuild your life on a foundation of truth. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the only way to save a family is to be willing to lose it first. The people who truly love you will find their way back when you stand up for what's right.